propose to move the amendment that appears under my name on the order paper, which is ask the House to decline to approve this statutory instrument. For total clarity, what's generally known as a fatal motion. Now, I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his very clear introduction to some of the scientific aspects of this SI and clearly setting out the differences between gene editing and older forms of GMO technology. And I'd like to thank all the Noble Lords who've joined us tonight at this late hour. Like the Noble Lady Baroness Smith of Basildon commented earlier, we are so often doing very important things very late at night, and I'm sorry about that, but that, of course, is not my choice, or indeed, I think, the choice of most members of your Lordship's House. Now, the Green Party's position against genetically modified crops and animals is clear, but I'm not going to make any arguments about that tonight. The argument that I'm making is that this statutory instrument is scientifically muddle-headed, unclear, and most likely to create a legal tangle. The fact is, though, that you don't have to listen to me on that. You can listen to your Lordship's Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee. And I think we have to give great thanks to all of the tremendous work that they do in slogging through so much material. And it's very clear that when you read their report, the length of their report, the detail of their report, their concerns shine through very clear about this statutory instrument. The Noble Lord Clement Jones, in the earlier debate, I think put scare quotes around the term technically flawed and suggests that that was a particularly grave insult in your Lordship's House. Well, I'm afraid I think this statutory instrument is technically flawed. Now, the basis of the statutory instrument is that plants that could have been produced naturally or by traditional breeding methods could be planted out in field trials without the current requirement to produce a risk assessment and seeking government approval for, as the Noble Lord the Minister said, for non-marketing purposes. But there is as yet no guidance as to what the scientific or regulatory criteria will be used to determine what fits the definition of it could be naturally occurring or by traditional methods. That produces what is referred to as a qualifying higher plant. Now, the language of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee is typically very measured and very calm, as you would usually expect. But what the committee does is regrets, which I think is a very strong word in its terminology, the fact that there is no guidance to explain what this means. And I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for arranging a meeting with himself, his officials, experts and a number of NGOs with whom I've been working on this. And it was asked then, when will this guidance be produced? And the answer was a few months' time. So we're being asked tonight to vote on something that we have no idea what it actually means. And I don't know if the Noble Lord the Minister can provide me with any updates of that tonight. But I think when you look at the consultation responses, it's very clear that this is not a term that's recognised in any existing markets or recognised in certified sectors such as organic. And I think it's interesting the Noble Lord the Minister in his introduction talked about how the US and other places are loosening regulation of gene editing, but they're doing it by changing their regulation of the method. They're not focused on the outcomes. So there is no other place that's working in the way we are and saying that these traditionally breeding or natural methods. Now, if you look at the response to the consultation, the Wildlife and Countryside link said there is no conclusive evidence that organisms created by gene editing could have been achieved with traditional breeding. The Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation found there was no basis for DEFRA's claims, bluntly noting that, quote, the entire purpose of expanding the use of gene editing is to create animals that do not occur naturally, or in this case, plants. The Organic Research Centre said that DEFRA's premise is unproven in theory and should not be the basis for changes in regulation or removing protections. Now, you might say that those are conclusions drawn from perhaps one side of this argument, but I'll point you to the Institute of Food Science and Technology, which called the government's approach overly simplistic. The Microbiology Society said it was purely philosophical. The Roslin Institute found it exceptionally challenging. The British Veterinary Association referred to it as fundamentally flawed and referred to the way the consultation was done as leading, misleading, and likely to be driven by industry. The University's Federation of Animal Welfare suggests, quote, the use of traditional breeding methods as a benchmark for what is and is not acceptable is neither useful nor scientifically literate. And finally, the FSA's Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes said that a yes-no answer on this question was just not realistic. It's first necessary to have clarity on what constitutes traditional breeding. So I think the key issue here is this problem of lack of definition. And we come back to the Secondary Legislation Committee, which again regrets that the government has said that it intends this SI to be the first step in a process with a broader changes to GMO regulations, but it provides no details of the context in which this instrument could be considered. And the Secondary Legislation Committee noted that were this to be primary legislation, there would be no doubt that Your Lordship's House would be trying to introduce definitions into a bill, as we would be able to, as we can't in an SI. So the committee concludes that with broader legislation, that would be the appropriate approach. And of course, we find ourselves in a remarkably similar situation to the economic crime bill we've just been debating. There, we're rushing through one thing with the promise of a second stage later, except we all know why we're rushing through that stage and there's good reason for it and people have agreed to it with the economic crime bill. We have no explanation of why we need this rush here. Now, I will just briefly mention that there are broader concerns about the guidance, which is to be produced by the Advisory Committee on the Releases into the Environment, generally known as ACRE, a government advisory body. All of the members of that committee have professional interests in biotechnology, and only one has expertise in ecology. None appears to have expertise in environmental toxicology. Now, there are many other concerns that I could raise, but I just want to come to one final point, which was indeed raised by the Noble Lord the Minister, which is the fact that this is regulations for England, and as DEFRA told the Secondary Legislation Committee, both the Welsh and Scottish governments have made it very clear that they do not wish to pursue equivalent action in Scotland and Wales. Now, of course, this raises an issue because seeds are not subject to border control. And the Noble Lord the Minister, in his introduction, as indeed did the government press release, spoke explicitly about sugar beet, which is, of course, wind-pollinated, which has the potential to spread over many kilometres and therefore crossbreed with wild or cultivated relatives. And it's interesting that this crop is focused on so often, given its destructive environmental and public health outcomes. So, my lords, I'm aware that we don't very often pass fatal motions, but this is a really crucial issue. We're encountering yet again, as we've seen in other cases, an ideology of cutting red tape. Now, I would say that red tape, as we've seen in so many instances, such as the terribly tragic case of Grenfell, are the rules that help keep us and our environment safe. And also, of course, as the Noble Lord the Minister said in his introduction again, the government is looking for purposes for Brexit and sees this as a possible purpose for Brexit. I think it's really important that we do have clarity on everyone's position on this SI. We're not voting, and I do intend to call a vote, on GMOs. We're voting on whether this SI is an appropriate instrument. So, my lords, I beg to move.